Hello, I hope you're having a great day. Thank you for stopping on my video. My name is Becky and this is BecxReadz. I post videos every 5 days, and if I can manage, I will squeeze some in between. And today is the start of a new themed reading vlog. I have about 3 buddy reads that I know of so far happening this month. So I thought I would just put them all in one reading vlog and share my thoughts with you on the books that I'm reading. First up, I am buddy reading I Married a Dryad with my friends Yami and Suleika. This is the latest book in Regina Abel's Prime Mating Agency series. I love her Prime Mating Agency series. I'm actually wearing my Alien Romance reader shirt today. Totally not planned, but I love this series, so I am excited to read this one. I am actually currently 50% into this book right now. And so far we are following Maeve, who is this woman who is like a hacker, and she wants to be in a relationship. So she goes to Keog, who is the guy in charge of the Prime Mating Agency, to hook her up with somebody who will be her soulmate pretty much. And he ends up thinking she would work great with this dryad named Helio. He is pretty much a human looking guy, which is pretty normal for Regina. Usually she's got like monsterish looking heroes, but the last 2 books she's done, they've been pretty more on the human leaning side than on the monster side. But he is pretty much just your standard man. He's got some like really dark green eyes so that you can't see his pupils. And he's got vines coming out of his body and stuff. He's a dryad. He's pretty much like a wood nymph fairy type creature. I am not loving this one at the moment because I don't feel any chemistry between these characters. Like, there's no real reason for these two to be put into almost an arranged marriage. She just wants to find somebody, and he's who she would be a good match for. There's really no tension, and there's no like hesitation between them. And so immediately when they meet, they're like, oh, we have this strong chemistry. And I'm just thinking, where though? Because you literally just met each other. Where is this strong chemistry that you keep saying you have? Because I don't feel it. I also feel like this is way too info dumpy. There is a lot of description about the planet and the creatures on this planet and how things work on this planet, which, while fascinating, I'm getting more of that instead of relationship development. And I don't care about this. I want to develop their relationship. I want to get to know these characters. And because they're automatically attracted to one another and they think they have such strong chemistry, it's not a focus, and I'm not enjoying it. One of the teens in his species has been like kidnapped and trafficked, and so they are trying to figure out what happened to him and get him back safely, and that is where I'm currently at. The other book that I am currently buddy reading is Road of Bones by Christopher Golden, and I am reading this with Jack at Jack in the Book Stack. This is a polar horror. It is set in Siberia, one of the coldest places on Earth, and these 2 men are trying to film a documentary that they can in turn hopefully sell to some network to, you know, make them rich. And they are traveling along the Road of Bones, which is this highway in Siberia that back in Stalin's time, he made people, inmates and prisoners and stuff like that, build this road. And when they died, they were pretty much just plowed right into the road, and the road was built over them, hence the Road of Bones. And so they are traveling down this Road of Bones in this snowy atmosphere. I would not want to live there. It sounds cold and depressing, and I get cold at like 40 degrees. So living in this place that is like negative 40 degrees Celsius, no thank you at all. Anyway, they're traveling down this Road of Bones. They pick up this guide who is supposed to help them, like, tell them history and stories of the Road of Bones as they're going. And they end up at this town where they're supposed to spend the night, except everybody in this town has disappeared. And the only person they find is this 9-year-old girl who is pretty much just catatonic. Just nothing going on. And they end up fleeing because these wolves start chasing them out of this town. And one in their group ends up actually dying. And so they make it to this other town where they can hopefully get this girl to her grandmother. And they end up stuck in this bar. And things are happening outside. People are dying. So I have a little less than 100 pages left to go in this. I am right there. So I just have this tiny little bit left. I think like 6 chapters left. So I will finish this today. So far, this isn't very horrific in my opinion. It's definitely tense and like atmospheric, but I'm not like scared in any sort of way. I'm more just like, ooh, this is thrilling type of story. Not so much a horror, but a thriller. I actually did have to Google because I wanted to see if the Road of Bones was an actual place, because this book did mention like Stalin and some history. And I was like, I wonder if that's a real thing. And it is. It turns out that this road is actually referred to as the Road of Bones, which is something I never learned in school, so I found that fascinating. I'm not hating it. It's keeping me entertained. I'm interested to see how this plays out. It's a very weird story, and it's a very quick read. It's a pretty short book. I finished reading Road of Bones by Christopher Golden, and like I said, I was buddy reading this with Jack at Jack in the Book Stack. If she does a vlog where she features this, I will link it down below so you can hear her thoughts on it as well. So I ended up giving this book 3 stars. It was fine. It was a really quick read. It kept me interested in reading it, but it was not at all what I was expecting this book to be. I went into it thinking that it was going to be like this ghost story about the people who were buried under the Road of Bones and how they were haunting like the people who lived there and things, while these people were trying to film a documentary about that. However, it turned more into a dark folklore story where they get to this town and they see it's all abandoned except for this one girl who is pretty much comatose. She's not there. And these wolves start chasing them, as well as like these other weird, scary creatures from the forest. So they are driving, trying to outrun these wolves and these other creatures to get this girl to her grandmother. And along the way, people keep dying. And it turns out that this has more to do with the Siberian folklore of spirits and souls than it does ghost stories of the people who died on the Road of Bones. I did enjoy the folklore aspect of it, because while I was reading, as I do when I'm reading stories about folklore or mythologies or anything like that, I Google and I see where it derives from. So I learned a little bit about Siberian folklore and these spirits and these evil spirits. So while I liked that, it just wasn't what I was expecting. I didn't feel a strong connection to any of these characters. Like, most of them, spoiler alert, die, and I could have cared less. I also didn't love the ending of this story. If you were looking for a story that has a solid ending to it, where no questions are left unanswered, this is not the book for you, because this is a very open-ended story, and you were left wondering, what the fuck happened? If you're looking for something with a very isolated, very cold setting, this definitely has it. That was one of the things that worked in its favor. Is it's very atmospheric, it's very isolated, and it is very eerie. Just go into it knowing that it is a dark folklore story and not a ghost story, okay? I also finished reading I Married a Dryad. This was a disappointment. I ended up giving it 2.5 stars. I love the world that this was set in. It is so beautiful. It's a very lush, green, beautiful planet with all these cute little critters in it. So I loved the world. I also loved Helio's magic, because he is a dryad. He has like vines on his arms, and he can take root, and he can sort of sense what the trees and the spirits are feeling around him. I also really love the incubation period for the babies of this. 8 weeks. The kid pops out, climbs into this tree, and this tree finishes incubating them, which I loved that. I thought it was very cool. I also really liked the human trafficking plotline of the story. I thought it was a really well integrated plot. However, I think this was way too info dumpy. It was way too over descriptive of what the planet looked like, what his powers were, what each critter was, and how they belonged into this planet. And even though I liked the trafficking plotline, I thought that was even too overly described. I was with it for the beginning of it. I really thought how they went about trying to save this young sapling was really action-packed and interesting, but it dragged on too long, and I was like, okay, can we get back to the point of the story? I didn't feel any chemistry between these characters because there really wasn't any sort of tension between them. They did have one argument, which I thought was pretty realistic because they don't know each other. They literally meet, they get married, they consummate their marriage, and then they start on this human trafficking plotline. So they don't take time to get to know one another really well. And I felt like I knew more about the planet and the magic and how things worked than I knew about the characters. I feel like this story would have engaged me more and I would have felt their chemistry more if instead of Maeve just looking for her soulmate, if she would have been like contracted to help Helio find the missing people in this human trafficking plotline. That way they would have been brought together and they could have had like some tension between them of her not wanting to help and taken away from a different job, but also wanting to help because she's a good person, and him having to learn how to work with her. I feel like that would have been a better dynamic and I would have felt their chemistry. This is by far my least favorite of the series at 2.5 stars. I feel like the smut in here, I would give it about 3 chili peppers. There was some creative smut in here. He's got some creative anatomy, but it wasn't very satisfying smut because I didn't feel their chemistry. But I will continue on with this series because I just love it that much. But that's all I have to say for I Married a Dryad. So for my next buddy read, I am reading As Long as the Lemon Tree Grows by Zulfa Katao. And I am buddy reading this with Kristin at Kristin Craves Books. So going into this, I'm 100 pages in right now. So I expected this to be more historical. I know nothing of the Syrian Revolution, quite honestly. So I thought that it was like early to mid 1900s. Boy, am I dumb. You can tell I was not educated on this at all. The Syrian Revolution took place in 2011. So while I guess it is historical, if you want to feel really old, I mean, 13 years ago, I guess that's historical. So we are following this 18-year-old girl named Salima, who is one of the last surviving members of her family in Syria. Her mother has died in a bombing. Her brother and her father, I believe they've been imprisoned, but she isn't sure if they're still alive or not. And her sister-in-law is her only remaining relative, and she is 7 months pregnant. So she promised her brother that she would get his wife and their baby out of Syria into safety, but she is also one of the last doctors in Syria. She was going to school to become a pharmacist, and then the bombing started happening and the revolution started happening. So she was thrust into the role of being a surgeon, being a doctor, when she's not super qualified for it. She's just learning on the fly because she's one of few people who is capable of helping. So she's battling with staying in Syria to help the people who need the help, or getting her sister-in-law and her unborn niece or nephew to safety. And in doing this, she has suffered a lot of PTSD and anxiety, and that has manifested into a physical being, almost one that only she can see. And so she often sees this embodiment of her PTSD and her guilt and her anxiety, and he wreaks havoc on her mind. He is constantly asking her, why haven't you done this yet? If you don't do this, I am going to plague your mind with your worst nightmares. And he often does this by making her relive the last moments of her parents' lives and showing them in the worst situation. So this does have PTSD rep in it and severe anxiety as well. So I thought that was an interesting concept to have her PTSD and her anxiety manifest in a way that is like almost physically present with her. But this book starts off, it thrusts you into this war People are dying left and right, very brutally. You see her describe these innocent children who are coming in with missing limbs, full of bullet holes, things like that. And it's just a very dangerous situation to be in. So this book starts off right there in the middle of the war. And it is not a feel-good book by any means. It is depicting what I'm sure is a much softer light than what the reality of a war would be. So far, I can't say I'm enjoying it because it is a very tense and very sad story, but I'm liking it to the extent that I'm learning something about it. Like I mentioned, I knew nothing of the Syrian Revolution. And so reading this, and they started mentioning things like YouTube and cell phones, and I was thinking, this has got to be more recent than I thought. So I had to do some Google researching on it, and I found that out. So I'm liking that I'm learning something from it. I like our character. I like how she's battling between doing what's right and doing what she was promised that she would do. There's a hint of like a romantic element in here. I don't know how far that's gonna go. I might update you when I'm completely done, but that is where I am at currently. I ended up giving this 5 stars because it was such a powerful story. This was a very intense, very sad story. It had pockets of hope in it, but throughout the whole story, I was pretty much anxious. These characters couldn't catch a break, and then something would happen, and I'm really glad that I buddy read this with Kristin because it enlightened me to some of the things that are going on in Syria. The author did mention that she took some liberties with the time frame of certain situations that happened, but she did say that some of the things that were said and some of the experiences were true to people who had been there during the time. I really liked that I learned something from this book. I liked the characters and the found family aspect of this. I loved the sense of hope that these characters continuously had, even in the midst of this war. This had some really tragic but great PTSD anxiety rep in it that made me cry. There was a point in this book where I started crying because I was like, oh my God. And throughout this book, even though I was rooting for these characters to make it safely out of this situation, I was never sure if they were actually going to. And I felt like the ending of this book was pretty realistic. Everything wasn't just hunky-dory. You could tell that certain people still had lasting effects of what they went through. So I definitely think this is one worth checking out if you are into historical fiction. This does take place in 2011, so it's not as historical as a lot of other historical fictions, but it is still historical. And it introduces you to a place and people's experiences that you probably aren't even aware of. And this was my favorite buddy read of this vlog. If you made it this far into the vlog, could you leave me a lemon emoji? And until my next video, thank you so much for watching, and go buddy read a book for me. Bye.